Okay, great. Well, thank you all for being here. A couple people I'd like to thank up right up front is first of all Aaron, our technical person, who's doing a great job managing slides. Oksana, who really helped me to. We this originally was a 12 concept slide deck, and we've cut it to six, hopefully for kind of picking out the kind of the key parts. And we wanted to be sure that we had time to work with these, so that's why we cut the numbers down with translations and so on. Well, I really appreciate her and all her efforts to do that. I'd like to thank Ole. He sent me a great email with some wonderful resources about Ukraine and the army, and so I really appreciate him and all of his work and his his service as well, his service to the country, and it's great. I want you to know right up front, I'm a Ukrainian supporter. I got my Ukrainian tie on, which I sport very happily almost everywhere I go. My patients wonder what it is. They think it's some cool emblem of something, but I just let them know it's that I'm a big supporter of Ukraine, and I really appreciate that. And finally, I would like to thank Carl and Jim. Have been not only through my life, have been they both been, by the way, my boss and my mentors through the years, and I really appreciate them and the opportunity to that they gave me to be here today. So with that, we'll get started. A little bit about myself. I spent 34 years in uniform. I was initially a cook in the Army, enlisted for a couple of years. After that, I was a field artillery officer doing nuclear targeting back in the days of the Cold War with artillery. And so we did that for about 5 or 6 years. And then I became an Army social worker and did that for the last 25 years or so. And so have had a variety of assignments, research, policy, direct practice, um, you know, a lot of almost everything you can do, public health. I've done a little bit of everything. And currently, since I retired, I've been helping out, doing some editing, doing some reviewing of different articles and books and things. And then I also see patients one day a week at Brooke Army Medical Center, where I work with children and adolescents. So my shtick on Thursdays is seeing kids. So I just got through with that yesterday after about 9.5 hours of direct care. So my brain's still kind of spinning off of adolescent talk. So I'll be trying to keep it straight today. See if this works. Yeah. Here's a little informed consent slide, just simply saying that um, the things that we've come up with really are based on personal observation and or research. I've tried to reference that as much as I can. To give you a little bit of background, this was a slide deck that Carl and others of us worked on, gosh, literally 19 years ago. So that if that ages us, but I've updated it. We've kind of picked out the top six, and I've updated the research. So at the very end, there's a couple slides with the research related there. I will tell you, it was interesting updating the research because in almost every case, the current findings over the last 19 years have basically just confirmed what we were thinking about at the time, with maybe only one finding or even just our personal opinions. But it's been fleshed out over the years and kind of proven us to be right on a number of things. So anyway, and the final point here is just that these are our personal opinions. These don't reflect, of course, the United States or the Department of Defense or anybody else's opinions. These are ours. Uh, as a background, before I go into this, the six concepts have been set up in a way that shows first kind of the issue. Then there's a slide that talks about kind of the research findings or where we kind of came to that conclusion, along with some recommendations, and then finally kind of a final point slide. So it's sort of like a three slides per concept. What I'd like to do is I'm far less concerned about us getting through the slide deck than us having time to open up the conversation and just to talk about these concepts, to share if there's questions or maybe different understandings. And obviously, what goes on in the U.S. Army is probably somewhat different. I imagine that goes in that goes happens in other armies. But we all know that we're all people. Soldiers are soldiers. Carl Castro just did a great book, The Boys in the Barracks. So he's very familiar with how we work in the military, just as people trying to be people and trying to survive and form groups and do the things that we need to do to become a team and make things happen. So with that, again, I don't care so much that we get through the slides, more that we really have a discussion about this. And that we can work from that. So this is our tough fact number one. So these are 6 facts that we've sort of put out there to say these are hard. And to give you an idea, this really is a slide deck that's aimed at those in uniform. So chaplains, people that, psychologists, social workers, psychiatrists, others in the helping professions, medical personnel who are working directly with soldiers, usually in the context of being in uniform or working directly for the military. And there is some differences. Just to kind of quickly bring that up, one of the hard facts, and we this is one of those beginning slides of that, but one of the hard facts we have to realize is that what we do and the way we practice in peacetime or the way that we practice after an event happens, and I'm thinking like rape or a traumatic, bullying or a traumatic event, the way that we have to practice that kind of mental health is very different than what a person has to do when they're in uniform on the front lines. And I know Ukraine sort of splits that into 2 groups, sort of the medical group and then the psychological people that are more assigned to the military. But the truth is there's just a different set of rules, and it's hard. Sometimes I have difficulty explaining to civilian practitioners the fact that combat stress control principles are very different and serve a different purpose than CBT or all the other sort of theories of practice theories and methodologies. And the reason is because when you do some sort of PTSD work, whether it's primary exposure, EMDR, all those sort of things, there's sort of an underlying assumption that what we're doing is we're going back in the past and resolving a past issue. The problem is when you're on the front line, you saw a horrific incident this morning, and you're struggling right now. And the truth is, I need you to get better enough that you can roll out tomorrow and be an effective team member. In other words, it's an ongoing trauma. It'd be almost like trying to work with a rape victim who could potentially be raped, every other day of her life going forward. And so how do we manage that? And it's just a different set of needs. And also just we have to also recognize the fact that it's not, we think about the need to help someone be able to stay on the front line because we need them in combat. And that sometimes, for example, there was a study that was done within the last couple of years that basically showed that all of our combat stress control treatments really don't necessarily prevent long-term PTSD. But that's kind of a different goal, I think, than what combat stress control does. So to speak to that directly, when you're keeping someone in the front fight, we realize that people are going to go back out who are not fully put together. They're going to fight on the front lines. They're going to continue to put their lives and their mental health at risk to continue to do the fight because that's what the country needs. We do the same thing with soldiers every day in Ukraine. We have people out there. We know that they could potentially die. They could come home maimed, etc. But we need them to do what they do every day on the front line. And the same thing's true for soldiers with their mental health. We try to help them collectively get it together today so that they can be a fighting force tonight and tomorrow because that's what we need. And if it gets too bad, obviously if they have a complete meltdown or they become a serious risk to themselves or others, then we have to go in a different direction. But as much as we can, we try to resolve, not resolve, but we try to kind of keep things together while they're in the fight. So there's really 2 different pieces of that. And so we're talking 2 different set of situations. One is civilians working with, after the fact or far from the front lines who can work on sort of the deep processing of PTSD through our standard methodologies. And then there's combat stress control operations. This slide deck is really about those who are working on the front lines with frontline soldiers who need to preserve the fighting strength every day. That's kind of what this slide deck is about. So when that happens, one of the first things we have to discuss is that the military and those in uniform who are also mental health professionals or helping professionals of one kind or another, they really have 2 masters. So what did we find out? Well, we found out that first of all, soldiers need to have some kind of confidentiality. They need to have some They're not going to talk to anybody that they feel is going to dime them out or that's idiomatic, isn't it? Dime them out. Anyway, who's going to tell, um, speak to some people, like the commander or the first sergeant, and basically force them into a situation where they may get in trouble or they may get kicked out or some kind of adverse action taken against them for disclosing their mental health condition, or in fact, disclosing the mental health condition of a fellow soldier. So, so we have to make sure as much as we can that there's some limits on confidentiality, that we're clear about that. And Ole speaks to that, I thought, very briefly in his paper, but he addressed that in his recent paper on the combat path, the fact that there needs to be some confidentiality, and folks understand that. But the problem is you also have while you're a combat person, you also have to recognize that the team needs its members and that those team members are going to be put at risk. And commanders have a right to know and a need to know, are there soldiers, if I roll out today, if I head out of the into the fight, are my soldiers going to function? Are they going to function at a basic level? And so that's an important piece. So confidentiality is important, but also clearly there's times when we have to let commanders know what's going on. And sometimes obviously those things conflict. So what do we do about that? Well, some recommendations. First of all, it's really important from an ethical standpoint, and also just from to kind of balance these two different interests, that we think through and we set the confidentiality limits up front. So what can commanders expect of us? What can individual soldiers who are sharing information with us, what can they expect for confidentiality, and when would we be likely to breach that issue? And sometimes we have to broker a deal. Sometimes we have to release more information or less information. We just have to work that out. And one of the things that's very helpful is if we have other people that we can reach back to who understand how these two things conflict, to have someone that you can call for consultation and say, here's my, without using names, here's my situation. What do you what's the way forward? How do I think through this? Um, and then finally, to place safety first. And that is critically important, that we think about the safety of that individual soldier. We also think about the collective safety of the unit and those that are in the fight. Because if we have a soldier break down on the front lines, it ends up taking one, two, three people to end up getting pulled out of the fight in order to help that person. So it's a debate. So so professional concept number one, act as ethically as possible. And it's hard because we have to keep those two things balanced in mind. So with that, let's open up. Is there any questions or comments or experiences that anyone would like to share about that? It must be a Friday evening. Everybody's quiet.
It is important that each profession and each nation has their own sense of ethics, and I think that's really important, that it's not a one size fits all. There are some universal ethical considerations, but there are also professional ethical considerations that can clash and conflict with the military's mission. And so there's no right or wrong answer in a lot of these things. And your point about, the safety of the individual, the safety of unit members, I think is all really, really important in trying to balance those.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. Well, since there's not a whole lot of discussion, we'll go ahead and we'll move on. Tough fact number two. Tough fact number two is that soldiers expect, and when I use the word soldiers, I'm also speaking Navy personnel, Air Force, however your services are organized. Those that serve expect helping professionals to fix organizational problems. So what do we mean by that? Well, it means that some problems that we have are organizational in nature. Sometimes there's toxic leadership, bad bosses. There's sometimes bad policy. There's things that affects soldiers that make it difficult for them to do their job or to want to do their job. And to give you an example of that, years ago there was a group of soldiers. I think it was a squad or a platoon that was out on the front lines with Iran. They were in Iraq, but right up against Iran at the time of the war back then. And they refused to, and they're getting shelled every night. It was a little outpost. They're getting shelled every night and shot at, and it was a pretty terrible place. And the commanders wanted to rotate them out, but that this group had refused to rotate out. So a group of us went out, talked to them, to, kind of find out what was going on. And what they basically said is they said, well, we're out here getting mortared and we're getting shot at, but at least we understand why we're here. When we go back to the big base, the sergeant major makes us do all these kind of dumb chores to include things like raking the rocks so that they're nice and smooth. The rocks on the ground so that the ground is nice and smooth, and then has a sign that says, "Please don't walk on the rocks." And they were just like, there's just these dumb requirements that get set up sometimes by leadership that we don't understand, and we'd rather be out here getting shelled because we understand the nature of what we're doing, when back in the rear it doesn't make sense. So sometimes there's these toxic um, ideas, and it's not that they're initially bad. It's just that they tend to, if we're not in contact with soldiers, if we don't understand how they're feeling, how they're thinking, what their needs are, sometimes we disconnect that with policy, or leadership can get disconnected from the soldiers, and therefore we make problems, and it becomes an issue. Um, so helping professionals, again, as we mentioned on the last concept, are really kind of responsible, sort of being a back door for these soldiers, because a lot of times they don't have a voice. They have no way to get to higher commanders to be able to say, hey, this is a dumb policy, or hey, this makes no sense. Why are we doing this? To be able to fix some of those things that they see at the ground level, and which is hurting their morale or their mental health function. So kind of working back channel, it's really important for us to be able to go to leaders and do that. And it's hard sometimes because oftentimes military people work for those very commanders who are setting those bad policies, or have doing things that are hurting soldiers and their morale. So sometimes we have to do the hard thing and go to them and talk to them about that. Some things we've learned about leaders, I think this is probably a fairly universal truth. Going to leaders with just these generic thing, I heard that this is a bad policy because I heard it from two people, and they don't like this thing, and that's not a very compelling thing. Going to leaders, you really have to be very explicit about, again, not using names, but they need to know, is this truly a universal issue? How do you know it's an issue? Kind of back it up with facts. How do we know this is an issue? What are our specific suggestions to fix it? So, commanders got a lot on their plates. They don't need a whole bunch of new um, things that they have to figure out. They need very specific ideas that they can implement right away, especially when they're in combat. There's just a lot going on, and they're not getting a lot of sleep. They're putting themselves at risk all the time as well. And so, being very specific about what the issue is, how you know that's an issue, what's your proof, and then being able to be very clear about specific suggestions seems to be a good way to go. They seem to get that. We have to think systemically. So as clinicians, it's really easy for us to get into this sort of one-on-one counseling mode, and and that works great in the rear. But when you're far forward, you really have to think about problems in general. And it can cover a range of issues. It can be sanitation. Maybe soldiers are getting sick, and hopefully medical personnel are watching that. But sometimes they don't hear that from the soldiers, and so we have to be a little bit of a buffer there to hear what they have to say, think through those issues, and then get to the right bosses, and make that happen for them. And then the final point: use environmental solutions where possible. Oftentimes, leaders don't mean to do things, either say things, do things, or set policy that harm soldiers or make the mission harder. So, but sometimes we have to go in there and help solve those problems because that alone can really make soldiers' lives easier at the ground level, and it affects so many people. So if a, you can end up with a whole group of people who are depressed or angry or anxious because of environmental issues, and some of which we can solve simply by fixing a leadership or a policy issue. We have to be sensitive to those. So the bottom line professional concept is we need to operate at multiple levels within an organization, which means that we keep our pulse on the individuals. We also keep our pulse on the leadership. And then we also help translate for leadership what the needs of the soldiers are as a backdoor channel. And that can come through medical personnel, mental health personnel, chaplain personnel, personnel, any of those helping professionals that have their pulse on hear what soldiers are thinking and doing can be tremendously important. I'll never forget, and I know Carl Castro's um, very has a history of. I mean, we used to talk about this all the time about porta potty art, which is sort of bathroom art and sort of in the field. And you'll see this, and we call it art because it's kind of like what are people saying when they're writing on the bathroom walls or they're drawing pictures or whatever. What's sort of the message that sort of baseline soldiers are doing? And I'll never forget this. One of my tours, I was at a prison system and was a mental health guy for some of the detainees. But among the guard forces, they had a lieutenant colonel, a female lieutenant colonel, who was in charge of the guard forces at that site. And she was very hostile and mean. And somebody had drawn on one of the bathroom walls this beautiful picture of the alien. If you've ever seen the movie Alien with that monster that's got the big face and there's like the jaw that comes out, there's kind of the extra jaw. And anyway, whoever had written this had put on there something to the effect of, and I'm be a little bit cavalier here, but it's soldier stuff. Basically wrote, it said Lieutenant Colonel so and so. I would rather get a blowjob by this guy. Period. The point being is that there was a lot of frustration in that unit with her and her leadership and some of the things that she was doing. And so, we were able to go back and actually take not so much the picture, but able to go back and talk to her about, hey, there's some really discontent here. And we'd done some surveying of the soldiers, so we had some real specific ideas to help her, not only correct her leadership, but to really correct the environment around them. And we made some positive changes. And it wasn't a lot. It was like 2 or 3 changes, and it very much changed the attitude of the soldiers towards her, and also changed kind of the environment on the post, so that on that little base, a lot more people were content and able to do their job more efficiently. So little things can make a big difference. Is there any thoughts that anybody want to share or questions about that? All right. I'm hearing none. We'll move on. This is about us. Helping professionals, oftentimes we build or maintain barriers to care. And I think sometimes we do this consciously and sometimes we do this unconsciously, sort of subconsciously. And we do it oftentimes because I think there's we get overwhelmed ourselves. I mean, that's just the truth. There's sort of we also, because of vicarious trauma and so on, we take on a lot ourselves. And so we end up building these boundaries, these things that kind of stop us from being able to be as helpful as we can be. That's not all bad. Sometimes we have to have boundaries, to be able to maintain our support and ourself. But there's also, we need to kind of carefully look those over to make sure we're not just doing it just kind of a priori. So here's the findings. Basically, we found that, and this has been shown over and over again, but there's a lot of common organizational barriers to getting mental health care. And that's both in peacetime and at war. It's both in the far forward areas and in the rear. Um, but when you're in far forward, it's very, very difficult to get care unless you somehow stumble across it, because there's not obviously, a lot of there's not, you can't just go around the corner to your local mental health guy. Um, it's sometimes hard to get a hold of. So we have to be consistent and do the things we need to do to reach out. Um, so one of the things that we do is we often find, and we know this, behavioral health people know this, but oftentimes we have to have the courage to do what it takes. To give you an example, when I was in charge of mental health on this base, we had about 4,000 detainees, and we had about probably 4, 5, 6,000 guard force members, and then some interrogators and so on that were there. They had guard towers. So they had these guard towers that were around the compound, sort of looking in again, just like a prison, right, would have guard towers. And I think there were about 7 or 8 of them. And they did two-man teams. So there'd be 2 people up in that tower at all times, and they would rotate every 12 hours. So they had a 12-hour rotation schedule. They would send a third guy around every once in a while to let them take a bathroom break or whatever. But they essentially was about 2 to 3 people in each of those towers. What we did is I told my mental health staff, and they couldn't believe how terrible I was at first. But I said, we want to divide up into 2 sets of teams, and we're going to go around and visit every guard tower every day and every night, because that way we would hit all of the soldiers that were in the guard towers every day to see how they're doing. We'd take them some cookies or just something to kind of go out there. Um, so probably about the first week or so, my staff was kind of griping, especially the night staff, because they'd have to be on night shift and go out and walk around and go to all these towers and talk to everybody. And it was a little bit tough. But over time, after about a week or two of this, they really found it to be very, very helpful. Soldiers would talk. They're up there. They're very bored. They don't have a lot to do, but they would actually be able to really have a chance to talk to somebody. And these are my mental health techs, but they were able to share, and it gave them a lot of support there. And we dealt with a lot of issues about things going on at home, homesickness, issues that just mental health problems, the little things. And we found that we could kind of stop that right at the beginning by having a little bit of support, having somebody come around and care about them really made a huge difference. Somebody outside their command even just showing up and just being there for them. And so we stopped a lot of problems, and we found our actual rates of sending soldiers home and the rates of soldiers coming to the clinic decreased fairly significantly by doing these outreach things. So it's important for soldiers to know, where you're located. They need to know how to get a hold of you. They need to know what hours, you're available, or how to, when are you available to help them. And then you also have to really push out front, and you have to be ahead of the game. And that includes prevention techniques, things that are going on. And I know a lot of that's going on in Ukraine now with presentations and different things about rotating in and out of service. Um, and I think that's really important. So those are important things. So the issue is really we need to eliminate organizational barriers as much as possible going forward. Any questions about that or thoughts? All right. Well, moving on. Helping professionals and other organizations, we often fight with each other. And it's really sad. I mean, this is sort of a sad state of affairs. In our military, we have a chaplain force, which is usually made up of members of different religions, Catholics and Orthodox and Protestants, Jewish. Um, there's many different faiths, but again, pretty much proportional. Mostly Christian, simply because that's the majority of people in America are Christian of some flavor. But also, we've had Baha'i, we've had um, Islam. We have a number of different religions that have chaplains, all of which are very helpful and good. But there's been sort of a historical fight between the religious folks, and I don't mean a fight as in horrible, but it's kind of a disagreement about they kind of look at us like we're some kind of anti, religion um, people, and we look at them sometimes as they're a little bit, over religious or whatever. Anyway, just there's been this sort of friction oftentimes between the two groups. We found over the years that we can work together and be super helpful if we don't worry about so much who's doing it or somebody stealing our turf. So essentially, the findings are that within any human system, the power and control issues take up a lot of time and energy. So there's oftentimes these internal conflicts that happen inside of our systems. And sometimes you find that on an organizational level between, say, the military itself and other non-government organizations or NGOs trying to be helpful, et cetera. So there's, sometimes it's two military organizations within the same military who oftentimes conflict, whether it's Army versus Navy, or the Army mental health people versus the Navy mental health people, and we all have our special, unique ways of doing it. We want to win. We want to be the number one bestest or whatever. And so there's these internal fights that go on. And unfortunately, that amount of time and energy and effort oftentimes really hurts soldiers and their families, because the time and money and effort that we spend fighting and disagreeing with each other internally simply takes away from our ability to actually provide care. And so that can be harmful. So, another finding is that there's always enough misery to go around. There's always more need in mental health than we could possibly do. So rather than fight with so much, we get into all these licensure issues back in the civilian world. I assume, I don't know that, but Ukraine may have licensure. I assume if you're a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a different kind of mental health person, that you have some kind of a license, or there's some way that they know that you're official or whatever in Ukraine. In the United States, we have something called licensure, which we license people to practice these professions. And sometimes the professions end up fighting each other about issues instead of actually working together to do the best we can for everybody involved. So it's really important, especially on the front lines in the military, that we leverage every single person. So it's not about whether a psychologist is better than a buddy. If a buddy can solve the problem, that's one less person that has to go see the psychologist. If a chaplain can solve the problem, that's one less problem that has to be dealt with by the psychologist. If a medical doctor can take care of it, if it's a primary care person can work through the issue, that means one less person that it needs a psychologist. So the more we work together and leverage our assets and put our best foot forward, the more people we're going to help and the less time we're going to spend wasting on each other. So it's very important that we create professional networks. It's very important that we really don't worry about who gets the credit, but really just do the best we can in our own foxhole, and then be as helpful as we can to others. And understand that people are going to need to go where they need to go. I've had many patients who needed more of a religious background. I mean, they needed more, they would respond better to a religious viewpoint. And I absolutely will be very happy to refer those to a priest or a pastor of a rabbi, a person of their faith, because if they can respond to that better, that is awesome. So I'm not in competition for that. I really support them. We all know that spiritual aspects of people's lives, especially if they're a spiritually oriented person, can be very, very important for them to work through stuff. So again, it's working together and making those things happen. Um, and finally, if you're in charge, I think it's it's the responsible thing to do to always take responsibility for our failures and to give credit to the team for all of the successes. Being able to give credit. I mean, I think it's important to recommend your soldiers, those that work with you. Like for example, my time in Iraq, I did much less than my staff did. They were amazing. So over and over again, giving credit to them, because it's really the people who do the work is very important. So the bottom line is to seek accomplishment, not acclaim. So quit worrying about our turf and more figuring out how do we make sure our turf is that all the turf is covered, and that there's no cracks in the seams where people can fall through and miss the care that they need.
Tony,
Any questions about that?
Tony,
Yeah.
let me ask you to just stop for a second, and let's see if we can have some comments from any of our Ukrainian colleagues to share some of the experiences that they have had trying to deliver care to soldiers in the front.
Can you hear me? Can you hear the translation?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
I will be speaking in Ukrainian. I am Oleg Pokalchuk. Let me introduce myself. I'm a social psychologist and psychotherapist working with soldiers. Also, I'm an expert in psyops, and I have been working for 10 days with the adaptation doctrines used in the US Army. Every doctrine has some kind of blank pages or green pages where soldiers enter their commands, and I listened to one lecture about this, and I saw that the comments that were presented on the next slide were exactly repeating what I wanted to say in respect to this slide. The circumstances in which we are form certain behavioral patterns of the servicemen in Ukraine. In particular, a serviceman is not an informational vacuum. He has his phone, his smartphone. He is very much attached to the news from home, and so they receive and they send the photos. Also, they receive some maybe traumatic information from their relatives, and also they always compare what they actually see around them with the official Ukrainian propaganda, and this is not nice as well. And another thing, the methods I have been using were developed mostly in relation to partisan actions, to guerrilla actions, when the missions were carried out on your own territory. And the problem is that many servicemen have been fighting for 2 years without rotation, and some even for 7 years. Another issue is comorbidity, because we are dealing not only with the professional soldiers, but with the people who just 2 years ago couldn't possibly imagine themselves as servicemen, but they are still doing it and doing it well, but they have a whole package of somatic and psychological problems, and we have to deal with this. Another thing, as regarding the Vietnam veterans, there are certain alcohol abuse and drug abuse among them, and we also have the problem that many military tend to play in the casinos, and we all understand why. And also the behavioral patterns of the servicemen change and take the shape of patterns, and this means that people who come back home for a leave for some 2 weeks, what do? They go to a civil psychotherapist, and this is an interesting phenomenon. They, for different reasons, do not feel free in the combat environment. Of course, the recovery protocols are good, but I am talking about the work of professional military psychologists, which is carried out under the conditions of high intensity conflicts.
You can compare the psychology of servicemen with what was felt during the First World War, because this is a trench war with a lot of losses on both sides. And psychological effects and outcomes are very similar. The slides that we have already seen now, confidentiality. Servicemen, I mean, not all of them, but I very often hear that from colleagues that servicemen think that a military psychologist is a whistleblower or something like that, and it's just not safe to talk to them. They will not really be encouraged to do a serious conversation, but would rather want a pill. And confidentiality is difficult. It's difficult to maintain confidentiality there. Should the commanders know what worries the soldiers? Yes, but this is not their primary task. Their primary task is to do what the commandment tells them to do. And then what is required of a psychologist is put people back into fight if certain psychological problems prevent them from doing that. With all of the theoretical constructs or good talks about how it should be done, we have the reality of how it is done, and the people, even with the recommendation of a military psychologist, can be sent into a hospital where very quickly they will be diagnosed with a behavioral disorder, and then 2 weeks later they will be sent back. But honestly, such a person has to be released from the army because of a serious trauma. That's about the conflict of interests. More about that. Can you imagine a commander who says to a military psychologist that psychology is a science? No, no. They will think that you're all charlatans if you're here. Just do something useful. I don't draw a picture or whatever. The approaches are very different because people are different. Psychologists have different quality of their training. They are with a different level of intellect, and their traumatization will be different even in the same circumstances. And people who come to them are also very different. What can specialists do? Or what is effective in? It's just building trust. If you are together with them fighting, then yes, you can be trusted because you saw, you heard, you saw it all. You saw people injured, you saw people dying. When a psychologist and a private or whoever see the same stuff, yes, then you get trust. I would talk or differentiate ethics from moral, because moral, it's how you treat people who you know personally. Social ethics is how we treat everyone else. In our country, we're good with moral, but we're not very good with social ethics. We're still in the making. So moral behavior. empathic behavior, friendly behavior, moral behavior. In my opinion, it's more effective than any kind of talk about ethics. That could be a difficulty of translation as well, but when you spoke about chaplains, I totally agree because that's what I did myself. Because chaplains talk about the moral side of the things, about values, missions, and so on. Do the soldiers expect that specialists can fix organizational problems? No, they do not. Organizational problems, oh well, we know that it's a lot about bureaucracy, mistakes that commandment makes, endless campaigns on fundraising for drones or something. We do have a people's army, which is good and bad at the same time. And I'm highlighting that as a social psychologist because social impact, traumatic social impact as well, because now the society is going through deep re-traumatization for basically 10 years, 2014, the beginning of the war, then COVID stress syndrome, then full-scale invasion, and you never get out of one when the other comes. About leadership. The problem of leadership in the Ukrainian army is also the consequence of the experience in the battlefield. When we're talking about units, then a person who has no high rank or title can be a leader if that person has the skills to help others survive. And a commander sometimes who can be ranked higher but is clever enough will trust that person. And then a psychologist will understand how important such a leader is. And that's an ideal situation because you can trust that person in communication. But again, it doesn't have much to do with hierarchy. It's very random. And it's very good if you have such a leader that everyone will go after new people, those who have just came to the front lines as well. It's very good if you have such a person, and a psychologist can employ such a person effectively. Inside the organization, I don't want to go into too many details in talking about the types of conflicts that we have, because conflicts exist everywhere. I just want to say that these conflicts they're in their nature, they come very much from the outside. We have a lot about standards and standard agreements, trying to do something about it, but the problem always comes somewhere in the middle where there is an attempt to implement all of those good ideas and policies, training people, because even some of the specialists are those who have a good training. They could be clinicians, specialists, in various modalities. Some comes from Gestalt, some come from behaviorism, CBT, whatever. And you have to do with that something. There are recommendations about methods, but the field practice shows that not everything is doable when we have such a variety and when you have combat.
Oleg, can we see if there are some comments from your colleagues from Ukraine?
Oh, thank you, Ole. Those were some really good comments. I really appreciate that, and so thank you for sharing those. Absolutely. We have others. Well, just to highlight a couple things that Ole said that I really appreciate. These ethics and morals are very difficult. There's pros and cons because, and I love what you said about informal leadership. That's such an important piece. Um, and there's pros and cons to war. I mean, when you're in peacetime, or you've had times in the past, I'm sure your military was in a peacetime situation, obviously before 2014. Um, that there can be it's a sort of different, it's a different group of people who oftentimes get promoted, who get because they look good, they're well spoken, who they know, right? All those things kind of can get people promoted in a peacetime army. And oftentimes when that army goes to war, they find out that those are not the best leaders on the battlefield. That the leaders you need on the battlefield are exactly these informal leaders that come forward and are because they're smart, because they can gather people around them. They're able to, like Ole said, you help your team survive, and those are the people who ultimately will be looked to for leadership, are those who can help you make things happen on the battlefield. So for the soldiers, they want those who can kind of keep them alive, and for the hierarchy, they're looking for the leaders who can make things happen, right? They're looking for those George S. Pattons, right? Who are those people who can you know attack and win the war. My just a funny story. My great granduncle was a tanker under Patton in World War II, and my father kind of he was sort of picked up by the myth of George Patton, the general, and he would always talk about him in favorable terms. But whenever he did it in front of my uncle would turn beet red and have to leave the room because he hated Patton, because Patton drove his soldiers so hard. I mean, they won many of the battles across Europe because Patton pushed his soldiers so hard to win. But consequently, they didn't like him. So on the one hand, he's a great officer in accomplishment, but not necessarily the informal leader or the person who would necessarily take care of the soldiers. And so, unfortunately, war brings out those things in people, and that's it just is the way it is. But I think Ole is absolutely right. At the team level, uh, those informal leaders are really far more important and influential than the main leaders are. However, oftentimes those main leaders can set policies or make requirements or do things that can end up making soldiers' lives miserable. And so, if there's a way that we can help let them see that that's a bad policy, or that there can be a change, can make a huge difference for soldiers and their perceptions of the system, their perception of the army, that the army cares about them, etc. Becomes more clear that they're really that the boss has a mission to accomplish, but also cares about in a way about his soldiers and wants to make sure that they're doing the best they can and surviving and doing things. Um, in the most applicable way possible. Um, anyway, is there any other thoughts about where we're at, or should we move forward? Ole, did you have anything else you wanted to add, or is that we're ready to move forward?
I go ahead and see if there's any other comments and then move forward.
Okay. Any other comments? All right. And I just wanted just before we move on, I just wanted to also agree with Ole that these are hard questions. I hope everybody understands that there's no right answer here. There's probably a whole lot of wrong answers, but there's no right answer to any issue. And so part of that is the kind of that's why talking to other people, having consultation where possible. Yeah, absolutely. So Okay, well, let's move forward. Um, this is a tough fact that we found out. It seems to still be true a lot, and that is that combat and operational stress doctrine is frequently ignored, and we said ignored because it's not necessarily unknown. It's just that we tend to, both at the command level and among mental health professionals, we oftentimes ignore those kind of facts. So what do we find out? Well, first of all, there's this idea, as we mentioned right up front, that there's a difference in our traditional mental health theories and practices from combat stress control doctrine. They're uniquely different. They can be supportive. We may use techniques from each of the areas in different ways, but the goal and outcome are oftentimes different. Traditional mental health policies and practices are to help resolve trauma, help people with depression, anxiety, the standard reasons that people come in for mental health. And some of that's true on the battlefield as well. But the key difference is we're not there to solve their problem necessarily. We're there to somehow get them put together well enough to be able to send them back into combat. And that's a unique difference because they have to roll out that next day. We just have to, you just have to be ready to go out, or we may get bombed that night, or something else may happen. So there's this constant living in the condition while also trying to cope with the condition, and that's a little bit different. There's a number of mental health professionals, and again, I think Ole mentioned that briefly when he talked about there's people in the rear that are both oftentimes seen by soldiers to be more helpful because they're more confidential, but oftentimes those folks don't have a very good understanding of combat stress control doctrine, or they don't understand the military, or they don't understand how military people think, or they've never seen the trauma, so they don't see it in the same way. And so the key to this is simply to be as informative as we can to make sure that our practitioners across the entire countryside, as much as possible, understand these basic differences between traditional practice and then the way that we have to work it on the battlefield, and then also to kind of how do you work with the soldier. Since soldiers started coming home from our operations in Iraq and Afghanistan in the early 2000s, the military and the mental health community in the United States have spent a lot of time trying to kind of inform each other about this. So there's a lot more discussion about trauma across the board. There's a lot more. There's courses and there's handouts. There's all kinds of ways that we try to help ordinary professionals, wherever they're located, to understand more about military, more about PTSD, more about how soldiers can react and so on. In fact, Jim was just telling me this morning that the state of Maryland, I'm stealing your thunder, Jim. You should probably bring this up, but basically that the state of Maryland now, when they arrest someone or there's some kind of contact with an organization, will often ask somebody, are they a veteran? To kind of get this idea of whether there's some other underlying things that are driving either misbehavior or a touch point that they can get them into services. So Jim can talk about more of that later. But again, trying to get everyone across the board these opportunities to get them help when they need it, but they may not know how to do that. So we have to kind of reach out and make that happen. And as I point there in the third bullet, combat stress control doctrine may or may not reduce PTSD long term, but it does show we have pretty good evidence that, and I can tell you that from personal experience in a number of occasions, that we can preserve the fighting strength. We realize, and I hope everybody understands this thing that's going on in Ukraine, and I'm going to add to it Russia as well, because there's no doubt that many, many Russians, soldiers, family members, etc., have been traumatized by this. And so there's going to be a long tail to this conflict. Just like there was a long tail to World War II, there's going to be a long tail to this conflict, mental health tail. We're going to be able to get prosthetic arms for people. We're going to be able to get them wheelchairs. We're going to be able to do it, get them jobs. We're going to do a lot of things for soldiers when this war is over. But the mental health tail to this, meaning the kind of the leftover residue, is going to be around for a long time. It's especially true when you're in a country, as you all know, that's part of the conflict. The U.S. has been very, very fortunate because other than a few explosions here or there, a couple of incidents along our coast during World War II, we have literally not had a major conflict since our Civil War back in the 1860s. World War I essentially was a European war, overseas war. Same with World War II, Vietnam, Korea. Many of our conflicts have been send the soldiers out and have them do what they do, and then we try to deal with the aftermath of what happened to them later. This is a conflict for you guys when it's on your own soil. That's impact. It's going to impact your children. It's going to impact your family members. This is a widespread, as Ole said. This is a cultural trauma, and it's going to take years to correct this. The problem is right now we need soldiers on the front lines fighting. And so while we can deal with that trauma
Але проблема
later,
в тому, що нам потрібно, щоб в нас були солдати, які працюють на фронті.
was there a comment? Yeah.
I wanted to say something regarding the application of the COSACC doctrine and the PTSD. At least, according to my experience, there is at least one situation where it definitely works. If this is the trauma focus therapy, it really works for PTSD treatment, where we can use these treatment and control protocols, and we can use them as the starting points in order to search for a traumatizing episode and elaborate it. But the trauma focus therapy is probably an exception where the COSC works well. As regards the PTSD per se, the key point is that it is post-traumatic stress, while our military are in the conditions of constant re-traumatizing. The classic situation that the traumatizing environment stops, half a year passes, and then the military starts behaving oddly. This is not our situation because our servicemen continue taking active part in the warring actions. So the approach to PTSD should be changed because it is not a post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a multifunctional disorder which doesn't have analogous conditions. And this means that new protocols for treatment and observation and testing should be developed, because in one of the classic testing questions is how do you keep the lid of your post office box when you put the letter there? I can't even explain what does it mean to the serviceman on the front, just to give you an example. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's spot on. Thank you, Ole.
Безумовно, це був дуже вдалий коментар.
So I think that's absolutely right.
Дуже до діла, і ви безумовно праві.
I'm hearing Ukrainian. Are the Ukrainians able to hear Ukrainian as well? Okay. Just want to make sure they're.
Tony, go ahead and continue.
Okay. All right. Anyway, but thank you again, Ole. That was spot on, and that's the issue we've been having forever, is trying to figure out what theories, what practices can we use to be able to keep people on the battlefield, but yet remove some of that stress and hopefully find some way that we could even prevent long-term disability. We haven't found that yet, combat stress control doctrine is noticed is on this slide is effective for keeping people in the fight, but not necessarily resolving those or preventing those long-term issues. And again, the problem for Ukraine that you all face is that it's not just your soldiers. These are issues that we're going to be working with. Our wives and our families, our kids, our grandchildren are all going to be affected by this. And so how do we resolve that? And over time, I think we can use standard practices maybe after the war, but our kids are in it now too. I mean, those people in Kharkiv, I mean, they're getting shelled, they're getting bombed. So it's not an other situation. It's a right here and now. And so they're on the battlefield too, and it's difficult. Anyway, so the what can we do? Well, obviously, it's as we mentioned, it's important for our providers to understand traditional mental health practices and to also understand combat stress control practices and doctrine, and then know when to apply them correctly. Now, that doesn't mean that you always have to be right or that you always have to use, there's not always a right way to do it. The key is to understand what the doctrine is and then to apply it correctly. There may be times when using a combat stress control principle may be very effective. Let me give you an example. One day while I was on a FOB and I was doing practice there with some of the soldiers, I had this soldier come in. He was a young man, and he was very shaken up. I think he'd been deployed 3 or 4 times. He was on his like fourth or fifth deployment, which had been so basically years in combat, much like some of the Ukrainian soldiers, but he'd been constantly in combat rotations over and over again. And he was really shaken up, and he came in. And sometimes you just go with how you feel inspired. I don't know how to say that. Sometimes you go with what kind of comes into your head. And the day that he came in happened to be Veterans Day. So we have a day of the year. It's actually the 11th day of November, so that the day that World War I was ended is celebrated in the United States as Veterans Day. He happened to come in on that day, and he was upset, and we'd been doing some Veterans Day planning for some things, and so I knew it was Veterans Day, and this just kind of came out. It was our first session. I said to him, have you ever been to a Veterans Day parade? And he said, yeah, he'd been to a Veterans Day parade. And I said, have you ever seen all those old guys, World War I, World War II, Korea, all those old vets march in the parade? And he said, yeah. And I said, what do we call them? Heroes, right? He said, yeah. And I said, the reason they're heroes is because they went and did hard things so that other people didn't have to do those hard things. That's why they're heroes. And that's why you're a hero. And he kind of perked up in his seat. We made another appointment, which he didn't come to. And probably about 3 or 4 months later, I saw him in the cafeteria, and I just asked him how he was doing. He was doing great. I actually found his squad leader at some point and asked his boss, how he was doing. He said he was doing great, and it kind of pointed to that simple kind of putting into his head that he was a war hero, and that it kind of reframed his experience about the things he was suffering, and so that he could sort of take on that larger load and be able to, because he as a hero could see himself in that light, and then was able to rise up to that occasion. That's not necessarily a technique that would work with most people, but it seemed to work well with him. So there's these different techniques that sometimes they're just the right thing to use, and sometimes it'll work, and sometimes it falls flat. But there's these opportunities where we can use doctrine in different things, sometimes in practice at home, and sometimes in our practice on the front lines to make things happen. So we just try to do the best we can. It's very important. And one of the things that I've loved about reading some of the literature coming out of Ukraine is that you guys are on the front lines of this, and that's a terrible, terrible thing. But the doctrine you guys are coming up with is going to be very important. So we're all kind of looking to you in a way to work with some of these issues. What does work with soldiers? How do we do, as Oleg said, how do we work with soldiers that are constantly in combat, whose families are also being traumatized, who go on leave and they're getting shelled at their leave site, or they go home and they get bad news on their phone, or they're on the front lines and they hear of a different city or a different place that some of their friends have been. How do we manage that in a way that keeps them in the fight, but also hopefully over time we'll learn how to reduce the PTSD after the fact and keep them pinned together. That I don't know that anybody's broken the code on that, but I think that's really as we keep working this, hopefully we'll come up with better and better ideas going forward. So the outcome of that is basically to know doctrine and know how and when to apply it the best we can. And again, there's no specific right answer. It's really a professional judgment based on kind of the person you're talking to, the circumstances, and kind of what tools seem to apply the best for the individual. Any questions about that or thoughts? Okay. Burnout and compassion fatigue. These are two kind of specific things a little bit to mental health workers. And we get this burnout and compassion fatigue because we're also going through it. Our families are also going through this. And so we get a double dose. We're dealing with our own trauma that we see every day and experience. And then we also have to listen to other people's trauma and help them with that. So we end up getting a double or triple dose of whatever is going on in the communities. And so that can be sort of hard. So I think there's a lot of literature out there about burnout and vicarious trauma, but it's an occupational hazard and concern for mental health providers. So we have to be aware of that. We have to be thinking about that. And 1/3 of the deployed helping professionals report very high or high burnout. So I'm sure that's probably true. I imagine in Ukraine as well. There's a lot of burnout. And that burnout among professionals directly affects our ability to care for soldiers. And we start by putting up barriers. So as we talked about earlier, those kind of like, cutting our days down, how much time do we have for patients, trying not to go out as much. We sort of close in on ourselves. And that's kind of the first sign that we're having burnout or a loss of empathy for soldiers and their families. So we have to find ways we can keep ourselves open and work with our own burnout rotations or whatever we can do to kind of to stay on our game. So part of that's having, good helping networks, having your own therapist or person to talk to, having a wide set of friends and colleagues that you can lean on when you're struggling as well. And maintain clear boundaries. There's things we're going to be able to do, and there's things we're not going to be able to do. And accept our limitations. We're all limited. There's only so much trauma, so much grief, so much personal pain, and the pain of others that each of us can take. Now, it's a different amount. Oleg may be able to take a lot more than I can, or vice versa, but we all have our limits. And so figuring out where's that limit, how much of this can I do and maintain the ability to practice, to be able to maintain my empathy for soldiers. And you have to kind of figure out where that's at and go with that. So the finding is basically we need to take care of ourselves in order to be able to take care of others. So any thoughts about that?
The burnout is my kind of favorite subject, and I have been working on it for many years. I would like to advise you something from my practice. I use the burnout as a basis for post-traumatic growth. If the burnout is very deep, it traumatizes a person due to memories of how this person was before the burnout, and this fact is the most traumatizing aspect of it. So what do I do in this case? First of all, I use the image of a burnt forest. As soon as the old trees burnt, the new trees start to grow. We can see it very well in California and American forest, and this new forest grows very quickly, and this is a chance to become a new person. Sometimes we say it's better to live through one fire than through two house refurbishments. And we have extensive amount of difficulties. So the approach that I suggest is perceived as something surprising in the beginning, but it works. Also, the phenomenon of flashbacks when you recall the traumatic episodes. And for this, I use RTM and consolidation of traumatic memories in the following way. I take the flashbacks of a specific person as a component for the scenario of a black and white film which lasts 45 seconds. I'm not trying to open this traumatic pain because I don't know what will come out of it. So I say it is possible to live with it, and let's try to find out how to do it. And this normally makes people trust me because I don't look as an evil dentist, and it works. Thank you.
That's a great approach, Ole. And I to take a minute about the issue of post-traumatic growth, I think is really important. I mean, so and this is probably a concept with which you're familiar, but I always like to go back to this, both when I'm working with new trainees and even with us old crusty professionals, to go back to this idea. And if you haven't explored this, you really should. And we probably, if we haven't had a discussion about this, there probably should be a separate presentation sometime on this. But the issue is common factors in psychotherapy. There's been a lot of work done in the past. People have looked at this common, what are those common pieces? Because we have psychoanalysis and there's CBT, all these different techniques. But what is the core piece of our practice when we're with people that make a difference? And those tend to be things like our therapeutic alliance, our relationship with people, expectancy. So we talk about combat stress control. We talk about pies, that and one of those is expectancy. And it's the exact same concept. This expectancy, this belief that I have, and by the way, I use this all the time with my adolescent patients. We have a relationship, and my expectancy, my belief that you're going to be okay, that you're going to grow up and have a great life, is really, really important for these kids to hear from some old guy with gray hair. It's a belief that no matter how hard it is in school right now, I'm being bullied. I've got I've got autism or whatever my issue is. The truth is, you can do this, and you can get better, and you can have a great life. It doesn't mean it's going to be an easy life. It doesn't mean there's not going to be hills and valleys, but it means that you're going to be fine. And I think those kind of things, those issues of being in relationship with people, which is why outreach is so important. I mean, it's because people can use their cell phone. There's lots of websites and Dr. Google, right? There's all kinds of things you can do to look up information, but there's nothing as powerful as being in presence. And it doesn't have to be a psychologist. It could be their buddy. It could be their squad leader, their immediate boss. It could be a mental health provider, a chaplain. It could be anybody, but reaching out to them, being in relationship with them with an expectancy that I know it's hard right now, but you've got this, you can do better, you can make it, is really an important message. That message of hope is critically important. And I can't say enough about that because it's such a massive piece of what we do in psychotherapy. It's literally those two concepts alone make up for 2/3 of all the change in therapy. I mean, our little techniques make up like 15% of the difference. The vast majority of what we do is to be in relationship with people, to care about them, and to provide them hope, bring them hope. And that, if we can do that, almost everything else will fall into place. Thoughts about that or comments? Ola, you got something?
I would like to add. It was really great. First of all, I have just heard the words which I heard from one chaplain back in 2014. The only duty of a chaplain is to be beside a soldier in the most difficult moments of his life. And I think that the same thing could be said about psychologists. And the second thing, as regards the burnout and the psychotherapeutic approach in general, taking into account the Ukrainian mentality.
There is a thing related to idealization, remembering who they were before the war started. And when they think about it, it is only highlighting the difference between this and what's happening in the combat and this new life. It's difficult. In these cases, I tell the people that your post-traumatic growth is not going back to your previous skills and abilities. I'm not going to lie to you. That's never going to happen. There is no going back to the life that we had once. But you will have a new life, and you can't know what will be worse than the one which you used to have. I think it could be better. And then I tell people why it can be better. When the new things that happen after the burnout, it's something better, younger, fresher, and so on. Because when people are too tired and burnt out, they feel old, very old. And then I tell them it's the greeting of Ukraine.
So that's beautiful. Thank you, Ole. That's wonderful. That's what it is. I think our chaplains, they call it a ministry of presence. This idea, like you spoke about with the chaplain, um, the being with people, the being together with them, and to be able to sit with them in these hard moments, these traumatic moments, these moments of great feeling, of great unloading, if you will, is very important. So I think that you can't, all the other stuff aside, we have little principles and things, but those things, the being with people, the bringing them hope, being able to provide, which is really what Ole does when he talks about this new growth. It's providing that hope that there is a future that cannot be underdone. I mean, that runs through depression, it runs through anxiety, it runs through our patients who have PTSD, who have past trauma. It's not the past that bothers us. It's really about how can I move forward? What's my future supposed to look like? And if we can help orient them on that, then they're able to stay in the fight and they're able to continue to move forward. And with, as Ole says, without lying to them, without pretending it's going to be easy. The future is not going to be easy either. We have a lot of rebuilding to do. There's a lot of societal trauma we're going to have to work through. Um, so, no matter where this conflict ends up or when it ends up, and it will end. I mean, we all know from the history that conflicts do come to an end at some point. We've got to be able to keep our hope that we can move forward and make a better or at least a good life for ourselves. So that's the hope I hope that we all have moving forward. So thank you guys for having me. I think we're about done, but if there's any other comments.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Ole, for really this nice exchange. We'll see, we have about 4 minutes. We'll see if there's any other final comments from people who are attending the seminar. If so, please speak up. Carl, do you want to make any comments before we leave?
I just want to thank Ole and I want to thank Tony for just a wonderful discussion and presentation. I learned a lot as usual listening to the experts. So thank you both very much for taking your time and sharing your experiences.
Well, thank you, Carl, and for all you do. I mean, you're amazing. I don't know how you do it. Is it, go ahead. Sorry, Oleg, go ahead.
A couple of words that I will have to say. What is very important is this approach when we see the situation from the two sides. When I look at the courses from Bragg psychological programs from there, I understand that psychological military education is different. It's based on different experience. It's like something which is made of Lego bricks. We have empirical field material and we have to sieve through that, and then you will get gold. These two approaches are very different. These are two different realities. But when we have such discussions and contacts, we can see that. And I would like that to continue because, well, this is the only way how we can come out with some solutions that will be useful for all of us.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And I think the things that we share, what if it makes me sad that we are in the situation that we're in where have such conflicts all the time, because what we share as human beings, our desires to be free, our desires to be happy, our desires to have peace, our desires to work with others, these are universal desires, and so this it's unfortunate that we end up in these conflicts that eat up so much of our time and talent when we have so many other issues, whether it be poverty or hunger, the climate change problems. We have so many other as massive global issues that we need to be working on together, that we spend time fighting each other. It's just sad. And so, yeah, absolutely. We have to reach out to each other. We have to stay in contact with each other. We have to bring each other hope, and we need to continue to do that across the board. Absolutely.
Let me share with everyone, again, our thanks to Tony and to Oli. We're now in the summer months here, and we're going to have our next seminar on July 26th, the last Friday in July. And our intent is to focus on the challenges that women face in the Ukrainian military. And we hope to have both a Ukrainian and a US speaker to help address some of those issues. So I look forward to seeing everyone again on July 26th. With that, we'll end, and we will hope for continued progress as this war goes on. So thank you all.